Well, I want to go ahead and welcome everyone to today's Four Seasons Garden Club talk. We are delighted to have Vincent Simeone with us. He is an author and a very knowledgeable person. Barkley and Jim, of course, worked to recruit him to speak to us tonight. And he comes from the perspective that the people who deserve the most respect and accolades are the curators, gardeners, conservationists, preservationists, and protectors of the environment. I myself am an environmental scientist who work on water quality improvements as well as a gardener. Everyone on this call is a dedicated gardener, and many have been professional gardeners in their careers. And I know we're delighted to hear about thinking outside the box and alternatives to common broadleaf evergreens. So I have some places that I'm thinking of filling in the spring when we get to planting, and Vincent knows the growing region that we're in. So I'm delighted to kick it over to him for any more introduction that he wants to provide and to start the talk.
Thank you very much, and I really very much appreciate your time tonight. It's great that we can virtually get together. There are certainly advantages to Zoom, and I don't know how cold it is there, but it's pretty frigid here, and it's nice to be in my office doing this rather than on a train or a bus or whatever. So I appreciate everybody's time tonight. And ironically, I live on Long Island. It's exactly the same hardiness zone as where most of you folks are from. We used to be zone 7A, and a few parts of the island still are, but mostly we're 7B at this point. And so we have northeast climate, but we have warmer trends as well. So I'm really coming from the perspective of what I observe in all my travels and what I observe in gardening in my neck of the woods. Some of this stuff might be a little passe to you, but to us, some of these things are fairly new and newfangled things. But I always like to throw in some newer cultivars and newer things, newer trends happening as well, so that everybody can sort of learn from it. But so I'm going to show you some things that are possibly obviously known and popular, but underutilized. I'm going to show you some things that I think are pretty new. I always like to keep ahead of the curve. And, obviously, this whole debate about global climate change and all these things are very debatable, and a lot of people debating them. But if you look at the latest hardiness zone map, which was from 2023, it definitely shows an average warming trend, which I guess for the pessimist is not good, and we might see more trends towards very chaotic climate change and chaotic weather and those kind of things. I guess from the optimist standpoint, it gives us opportunities to grow things that weren't able to grow before. There is no question. I've been at the facility that I manage for 31 years, and there's no question that there's a lot of things that we would never even consider growing 30 years ago that we certainly can grow now. And part of that is weather related, but a good part of that is also better research, better selections of plants, the breeders doing a better job developing these plants. That's part of it. So a lot of technology and a lot of work has been put into plant research and plant breeding over the last 30, 40, 50 years. So that is coming to fruition, and there's a constant push, of course, towards the newer, the better. And so I'm going to show you some of that tonight, hopefully. So, and the idea of broadleaf evergreens to me, broadleaf evergreens, evergreens in general, but certainly broadleaf evergreens have the most at risk if you think about it. They're the most vulnerable. They always have leaves, right? They always have the potential for transpiration and respiration. They always have those physical leaves on them, even in the winter. So wind and ice and snow and the elements can get them in the winter. And in the summer, obviously, they're in the elements as well, as far as heat and humidity and all those things. So a dogwood, a forsythia of lilac goes dormant in the winter, and they've sort of liquidated any kind of risk, really, as opposed to an evergreen. So to me, broadleaf evergreens are a special kind of plant. And on top of that, I think as a gardening community, as a horticultural industry, like many things, I think especially we tend to stick with the stuff we know. We tend to stick to the stuff that's safe or that's always been used. And there's just a lot of things I think that have been overused and misused. And there's a bigger, brighter world out there. You as gardeners know this, that every winter, what do? We pick up a garden catalog and we're excited about all these new things coming out that we want to try. And sometimes they work and sometimes they don't, but that's the beauty and the journey of gardening, right? So I have always been a big advocate of trying the newest, brightest things out there. And as an arboretum director, I have that luxury because we have a large amount of acreage to do that. But I also consult with a lot of homeowners, a lot of small residential sites, and the same rules really apply to try these new things. So we're going to talk about some things, at least a few of my favorite things. And the average landscape, that a lot of work has been put into the house, but the landscape itself, very often when you look at the general public or just suburbia, there's really not a great, usually a very, very diverse plant palette, unless that person happens to be interested in gardening. Usually it's just what the landscaper decides to put in or what the landscape designer designs for you. And it's usually very monotonous. This is a pretty monotonous landscape, I'd say, with not a lot of diversity. And so we want a lot more out of the landscapes these days. I think people are getting more and more demanding out of what they want, which is good. But this is typical suburban neighborhood where a lot of these gardens, a lot of these landscapes are just poster, they're like cookie cutters. And we need to diversify the landscape more. We need to diversify the environment more and demand more, I think, out of landscapes. Um, Plant breeding priorities, certainly a big part of it is pest resistance. We want plants that don't require a lot of spraying or no spraying at all. We want them to be pest resistant. We want them to look good. And we don't want to have to go out to the local garden center or box store and get another chemical to treat them. So this is certainly true of roses and of lilacs and of a lot of other things that are much improved over the years. But we still have a ways to go on that, I think. Drought, heat, and cold tolerance, all big issues, of course, in plant breeding. We want plants that are more cold hardy. We want plants that are more heat and drought tolerant in the summer. We're seeing more extremes in the weather over the last couple of decades, and those plants need to be adaptable more than ever before. So that's something that's certainly being considered in plant breeding. Deer resistance, of course, we all know about deer resistance, and we all know it's a hot topic. It's a hot button item. And is any plant truly deer proof? Probably not. There's very few, I'd say, that any horticulturist would agree is truly deer proof. But there are relative deer resistance, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Broadleaf evergreens are tough with deer resistance because they always have leaves, and there's always that chance that a deer, even if it's not a palatable leaf, they're going to eat something to survive. So that's the other part of the vulnerability of broadleaf evergreens, is they always have foliage, and unless it's something really exceptionally bad for deer, they're going to probably browse on it. So that's a tough one with broadleaf evergreens, but we'll talk about that. We are certainly seeing in breeding a lot more compact growth habits and slower growth rates. Our properties in general across America are getting smaller. There's more subdivisions. There's more need for housing. There's more need to accommodate a growing population. And so we don't want plants to grow as big or get as large as some of the former species or former trait species. We want plants that are more compact, that have a slower growth rate, that don't outgrow their space so quickly. Certainly the idea of pollinator and bird-friendly plants is a big topic, and especially with flowering shrubs and trees, it's a hot topic, and we are trying to create a landscape that's more sustainable, not only for us, but for the wildlife that is benefiting from it. So that's a big ticket item right now, is looking at plants that are pollinator friendly and bird friendly. And then improved aesthetic value. We want plants that flower better, flower longer, have better foliage, better fall color, better fruit. All those aesthetic things that go into plants as well, and that's happening. Not in everything, but it's certainly happening in a lot of things. The more marketable a plant is related to its aesthetic value, for sure. So that's something that we'll talk about. And then, of course, breeding for sterility. Certainly the invasive species topic is a big one. And scientists are really looking at sterile plants that wouldn't set viable seed. The compact butterfly bush would be an example. The Pugster series is supposedly sterile. There's a fastigiate sweet gum called Slender Silhouette that is supposedly sterile and seedless. So there's a lot of move towards more plants that won't spread seed around from fruit and seed. So that's something else that's being very much looked at. So and again, I don't know if I've certainly been to your neck of the woods, and I certainly know that you can grow a lot of the same things that I can, and in some cases you don't, and we don't. But you know, just the generalities of things up in our neck of the woods. Prunus laurocerasus, the cherry laurel, is a very popular shrub. Our landscapes have been dominated by it because for most homeowners, it looks good, it works, it's easy to, it grows fast, it's easy to screen an area. Unfortunately, it's being misused and overused, and it's not a bad plant per se, but the way it's being used is really awful, unfortunately. So, how do we diversify these landscapes, and how do we educate the public that these things are wrong, and that, you know, we find that they're almost disposable in the landscape, that people overplant them so much and plant them so close to each other, and then plant them at the wrong time of the year, that almost inevitably, if we get a hard winter or if we get a hard summer, they're replacing their hedge again and again and again. So it's almost like having, you know, a short-lived perennial or an annual, and instead of a shrub, because they're constantly being replaced. And sighting is a big thing. So what else is there besides Prunus laurocerasus? What else is there besides boxwoods that get boxwood blight and box moth? You know, all these things that have issues. Are there other things that are better, that are more durable, that are better maybe for a changing environment than the same old stuff? So we'll talk about some of these things. You know, it's a beautiful plant, and typically it's not grown like this, where it has plenty of room to grow. It's typically grown on 3-foot centers or 5-foot centers, and it's sheared into a unnatural shape, and then of course it has all kinds of problems. This is how I would grow cherry laurel. This is how we grow it at the Arboretum, but very often it's not grown this way. It's usually grown this way, where it's a very tight, upright hedge, sheared often, and typically put in too much sun or too much shade, and usually planted at the wrong time of the year. So there are other things out there that could function in this way, and we'll talk about some of those things. This is typically when you walk around a neighborhood in our neck of the woods, what you will see around March. Plants that are usually suffering from winter damage. These are plants that are in the wrong area, sited incorrectly, and usually winter scald or winter burn or chemical burn from ice melt or things like that will get them, and this just is a recurring thing. They'll eventually recover, then they'll look bad again in the next spring. So there is a problem with this monotonous monocultures we create. And if it gets really bad, of course, I'm sure you've seen this. These are plants that are really in poor shape. We've seen a lot of this last year, especially last year. I don't know about you folks, but we had a very hot, dry summer. Especially August was really hot and dry, followed by a very cold periods of winter, no snow cover, so there was no insulation for these plants, and a lot of the plants that came out of the winter into the spring ended up like this. There are certain prunus I do like. I do like Autolucan much better than the skip laurels. I think it is a much smaller, easier plant to use in a residential landscape. I do not mind this one as much, and I don't see as many problems with this one. So I don't really want to target any particular species, but maybe the cultivar is the problem. There are other plants that we're testing. This is the Portuguese laurel. This is Prunus lusitanica, which is inherently known to be more tolerant, obviously from Portugal, obviously known to be more inherently heat and drought tolerant. Still good in our zone, probably even good to the warmer part of zone 6, but certainly good in zone 7. And this is a plant that I believe takes heat and humidity better than Prunus laurocerasus. It is can be shaped, obviously, you can see from these pictures. It's more of an upright grower than the Prunus laurocerasus, but it's similar in its leaf size. It's similar in its flower. It's not as ornamental a flower, but it certainly can be shaped into things that we want to shape cherry laurels into. And this is the foliage and the flower on Portuguese laurel. And our industry is getting smaller and smaller. The world's getting smaller and smaller. We used to say the excuse was, well, it's not available. And these days, things are a lot easier to find, or a nursery, a reputable nursery, can find for you. This wasn't really available in our area up until about 3 years ago, and now it's everywhere. And we're using it in dense shade, we're using it in full sun, we're using it in different areas, and so far so good. It hasn't had a problem. So the Portuguese laurel is one that we're using more often than cherry laurel. And the foliage is more serrated, a little more pointed than cherry laurel, but still an evergreen. And these shrubs can easily be shaped into a formal hedge like this on the left, or left more natural, as you can see on the right. But they do the job. They will function as a screen, they will function as a hedge, they will function as a foundation planting. Of course, this issue with boxwood, we all know the issues with boxwood. And if you go to amazing places like where you live, or Virginia, Delaware, New Jersey, a lot of these states have relied on boxwood as part of their landscape for so many years. This is a garden that I visited in old places of Japan, and the entire garden was boxwood. And they must have had 30 or 40 different types of boxwood there, and they were all sheared like this. They hadn't experienced boxwood blight or box moth or any of those insects or diseases, but this was certainly a monoculture. There wasn't much else other than boxwood. And I love boxwood. I think it's a great plant for certain situations. There are some varieties that are more resistant to disease and insects than others, although there's very few cultivars that are resistant to the box tip moth. But certainly to boxwood blight, there are some varieties that are more resistant. But the idea here is to look at alternatives, right? So if there is something that you can use other than boxwood to diversify your landscape that gets you the same look or the same feel or the same function, then we're going to look at a few of those alternatives as well. Whoops. And of course, boxwood, this is an example of boxwood blight. Looks like that someone lit the plant on fire, and it's not long before it goes through the whole plant. And sure, there are treatments, sure, there are things you can do to reduce the effects, but nothing that's going to completely save your boxwood. So why not try to diversify the landscape? This is a publication that I had something to do with. You can get this online. This is being updated right now from Cornell. So Cornell, I've worked closely with. And basically it shows group 1, group 2, and group 3. These are alternatives to boxwood. So group 1 would be the most similar. Group 2 would be similar in texture, but and similar in landscape function, but slightly different. Not the same, or some conifers, things like that. And then group 3 would be similar in landscape function, but would have additional things like flowers or fruit that might not be exactly what a boxwood looks like. So I could send you folks all this PDF if you'd like it, just to see this, have this on your computer. But this is just some of the research we've done to sort of come up with alternatives to boxwood. And certainly the first thing we point to is holly. The problem is holly's, Japanese holly anyway, typically grows much faster than boxwood. It needs to be pruned more often than boxwood. Typically boxwood has one spurt of growth, and you can shear it, and that's it for the season. Maybe you might have to re-shear it again if you really have a banner year. But with Japanese holly, they continuously grow, and they grow much faster than boxwood. So they're going to need more maintenance and more shearing to keep them contained. And there's not many cultivars that won't do that. However, I do think that this Ilex crenata soft touch is one of those plants that's going to stay small enough and not grow as fast to be contained in a knot garden or a formal garden, or as a low formal planting that you would see similar to boxwood. Obviously, the texture is similar. And this is a plant that's being used heavily by the landscape these days, and is available. These are all soft touches in the landscape. You can use them in multiple ways. Obviously, the one in the middle is a soft touch that's been sheared very tightly. On the left are buying soft touch in the nursery. This is what they're going to look like. And on the right is in a more established landscape. So they certainly will be very similar to a lot of the boxwood that we use. The other one is Ilex glabra, the inkberry holly. This is a very large inkberry holly, but you can certainly get varieties or shear them or prune them into more, manageable forms. And of course, this is a native that is pretty durable in the landscape. The criticism about Ilex glabra is that because it's a native and it's more usually in the wild, that it's less palatable in cultivated landscapes. It just looks wild and it's not as easy to control. It doesn't typically have foliage all the way to the bottom. Eventually, they lose their bottom leaves. But obviously, this one hasn't. This one has been sheared pretty nicely. But there are some new improvements to Ilex glabra that I'll mention that I think make it a good alternative to boxwood. There's inkberry. That's why they call it inkberry with those black fruit. This is a cultivar called Shamrock that's been around forever. Pretty nice emerald green leaves, obviously foliage all the way to the ground. These plants are about 10 years old. Very little shearing or very little pruning done to them. They have grown pretty slow and they're pretty uniform and pretty emerald green. So this certainly looks like a boxwood, at least from distance. And if you're not really emphatically needing a boxwood, then this would be something that could be another alternative to that. And Shamrock is a pretty available and pretty nice cultivar. And this is something I've been working with Spring Meadow Nursery in the Midwest. They are introducing specifically Ilex glabra cultivars that are specifically grown for their compact habit to potentially replace boxwood. So there's Gem Box here and there's Strong Box here. I'm trialing these now, and so far so good. They're nice, small, compact plants with very small leaves. They are leaves all the way to the ground, branches all the way to the ground, and they certainly can be used either as a single individual plant or in a hedge. They take shearing very, very well. So far so good, and these are becoming popular now on the market. They're starting to infiltrate the market. So we're not quite finished with the evaluations of these yet, but so far they're looking pretty good. So there is some production, some hope along the way that we can get some decent alternatives to boxwood. This is one I have to mention because it's so odd and so incredibly different than anything we've seen in a while. So this is a intergeneric hybrid between two genera, Canomales, which is quince, and Pyracantha. And it's an intergeneric hybrid called Paracanomales. And there's two. There's jukebox and berrybox. And basically, it's a very compact evergreen to semi-evergreen Pyracantha-looking plant with very small leaves that can be sheared. It obviously has fruit and it has flowers. But these are also, we're trialing these as well. And they make this nice compact mound. And these aren't quite available yet, I don't think. You'll have to Google them to see if anyone's carrying them yet. But these are also very small, compact evergreens that we're trialing right now that have potential. So kind of an odd thing because it's two different genera that are creating a new genus, but a very interesting combination: Pyracantha and Canomales. I know many of you folks probably are going to think that, we've been doing camellias for a long time, certainly in the mid-Atlantic states and the southeastern states. Camellias have been around for a while. For us in the Northeast, hardy camellias, we've trialed hardy camellias for 40 years. Dr. Clifford Parks and Dr. William Ackerman were the two main selectors and hybridizers and breeders of hardy camellias. We actually were the recipients of some of Park's work in the 70s. And from that came a lot of the April series. There's an April series and a winter series, the April series being spring blooming, the winter series being fall, winter blooming. But there is a ton of new things coming out on camellias. It's kind of hard to keep up at this juncture. They've exploded on the market. They've certainly exploded up here in the market, and they're just getting better and better every time I turn around. So we have a greenhouse full of non-hardy camellias, but then we also have at least 300 or 400 hardy camellias on the grounds, and we're trialing just about all of them. And they have great promise, I think. There are even, most hardy camellias, as you know, are probably at best zone 6, certainly zone 7, but at best zone 6. There are actually a few now that are zone 5B plants. So even my friends in the Midwest, where it's might be, near Lake Michigan, it might be zone 6. They're actually trialing them there. So I think there's a tremendous amount of potential with camellias beyond what we know, because they're so durable and they're so tough and they're so adaptable. And as we see this changing climate, I think one of the plants that's going to endure is camellias. I love this plant. This is a plant that's an original parks plant for us called April Trist. That is not a prune plant, by the way. That's just the way it grows. A nice pyramidal, dense plant with red flowers. So I do love April Trist. Completely hardy. This is another one from the April series called April Kiss, April Rose, April Blush. It used to be that you would never, the greenhouse, the non-hardy greenhouse camellias were much better in flower, much more floriferous and much more ornamental than the selections that were hardy, and that's not true anymore. The hardy selections have beautiful flowers too. And we grow these outdoors in the landscape without any protection. This is one of the coldest parts of the garden, and they're out there in pretty much full sun doing really well. This is one of the hardiest japonicas. This is Kumasaka. Kumasaka is probably a zone 6A plant. This isn't too much sun, that's why it's more of a greenish yellow, but we grow them in pretty dense shade too. And then Korean fire. Korean fire was found between in an area between North and South Korea. Very cold area. And so this is actually considered, this is rated for zone 5B with those beautiful red single flowers and extremely heavy bloomer. For us, these camellias like Korean fire are actually blooming right now. We've had blooming on our camellias from probably October and until the recent cold snap. This Korean fire was in full bloom. So I'm sure the plants are a little confused, but they're still blooming, believe it or not. The holy grail of camellias now, I think, in breeding is coming up with a yellow. Jury's yellow is a great plant that's really not yellow. It's more of a creamy white at best, white petals, and then the interior is more of a creamy white. It is a lovely, lovely plant. It's a durable plant. It's a hardy plant. It's got this nice, upright, compact habit, but I wouldn't call it yellow. I would call it cream color at best. However, there's a lot of new introductions coming out now. There's a lot of breeding going on to try to breed in the yellows, the really deep yellows, with hardy camellias. And so this is some of the newish yellow camellias that are a little more. This is lemon glow on the left, and another cultivar that's more of a single flower on the right. But these are newer selections that are getting there. Slowly but surely, we're getting more of a yellow to our hardy camellias. And the same thing with Camellia sasanqua. Camellia sasanqua was always believed to be less hardy than Camellia japonica, yet we're growing it no problem in zone 7. They're obviously fall bloomers, and they grow faster than japonica for us. They grow a bit bigger than japonica for us, and they're blooming from October until about January. And this is a newer series, the October Magic series. There's Inspiration, there's Dawn, there's a bunch of different ones, and these have been blooming for us for about 3 or 4 months now, and they're more compact, smaller leaves, and beautiful flowers. So, this October Magic series is one that we're doing a lot more with. There's probably, I don't know, 8 or 10 in this series that we're planting. And that's that same plant, a very compact plant, not a very old plant, but adapted very quickly. The Winter series, of course, which is an Ackerman hybrids. These are Sasanqua hybrids. Winter Star is one of them, been around for a long time and has been reliably hardy for us and also a good performer. And these Winter Stars were blooming last week. So even into January, mid-January, they were in full bloom. So it is until it gets really cold. We've gotten 15, 16 degrees. They're finally starting to slow down now. But to have camellias this early in the season, or this late in the season, however you want to look at it, is pretty amazing. This is one called Long Island Pink, another Sasanqua hybrid, and there's Long Island White as well. So I just wanted to mention this to represent, as they say. And that's Long Island Pink in full bloom in the fall. And some of these are these winter series plants are really nice. Winter's Darling and Winter's Joy, and some of those. This is Winter's Joy. Winter Snowman is one of the most cold hardy, one of the most reliable fall bloomers for us. This is easily a zone 6A plant. Blooms really good every year. It's in a decent amount of shade, doesn't really mind it, and has done very well for us. I want to mention this one because this one isn't known or used enough. So Camellia oleifera, which is the tea oil camellia, is a plant that's used or has been used in breeding because it's a solid zone 6 plant. It also has that beautiful, smooth, almost stewardia-like bark, and it grows into a small tree or a large shrub. So this is a plant that could get potentially 12, 15 feet, but it has these beautiful white blooms in the fall. And this is a cultivar called Lucian Snow. We've actually taken pollen from non-hardy yellow camellias and pollinated this one last fall to see if we can come up with a more hardy yellow. We'll see what happens. But Lucian Snow is not only a plant that's good in bloom, but when it's out of bloom, it's still beautiful because of that beautiful, smooth, cinnamon-colored bark. So this is one I really do like a lot. We have a Daphne garden at our garden, and you must be saying to yourself, who in their right mind would grow Daphnes in a garden? Daphnes are high maintenance. They regularly will die from Phytophthora. If they're overwatered, they die. If they're underwatered, they die. Daphnes are a tough thing to grow, and you have to be a gardener with a real steady hand to be successful with Daphnes normally. That said, we have about 40 to 45 different types of Daphnes in this garden. But the garden, as you can see, is a rock garden, and it is extremely engineered to accommodate Daphnes. Very, very well-drained soil with a organic layer. It has actually dry wells under it, so the water really drains. So Phytophthora isn't as much of an issue. However, one of my favorite plants, and going to school down in Georgia, they were everywhere, but Daphne odora, I think it's one of the best Daphnes out there. We're starting to use it more and more in this area of the country. The variegated one is a bit more hardy than the green one, but now there are some cultivars. We work with a nursery down in Georgia, and there's a bunch of green ones that are hardy, and there's a bunch of new variegated ones that are hardy. And it's not just this plant. It used to be you could just get this Oreo marginata. Now there's a bunch of named cultivars out there of this odora. And as far as durability in the landscape and a true evergreen, this has worked extremely well for us. And so you can see some of the varieties. Some are green, some are variegated, some are deeply variegated, as you can see from the one on the bottom left. And we have had no issues with hardiness on these, and certainly in the summer, they have been rock hard solid as far as drought, and have been very shade tolerant as well. So I like these newer Daphne odoras that are coming out. Not a bad looking little shrub. This is not pruned, by the way. This is just how it grows. And normally we don't have an issue with pruning it. This is a plant that we're trying to use more and more in the landscape. Daphneophyllum macropodum. I apologize for saying this. This is not a name that I made up, but if you talk to folks in the southeastern United States, the common name of this is not a good name. It's a name that they have to change. They call this redneck rhododendron. I don't know why they call it redneck rhododendron, but I think that's an inappropriate name. They need to come up with something else. And it's not help doing the plants any favor. I don't think commercially this is going to be viable if they call it redneck rhododendron. So they really need to come up with another name. But it is actually a very durable, tough, a large leaf evergreen. You know, it almost looks like the leaves of a rhododendron maximum or something. But they're in the realm of 10 or 12 feet, maybe 8 feet. They get, narrow and tall with these beautiful leaves, and give you great texture in the landscape. Very durable plant. This is one I've had for probably, I don't know, 12 or 15 years. And We actually limbed it up into a tree, a small tree, and it's wilting because it was cold out when I took this picture, but a very durable, tough plant that is extremely shade tolerant, and a plant that I'm starting to see more and more now in landscapes. And it is tough. I mean, it will grow in very heavy clay soils. It'll grow in very exposed conditions. Doesn't really have a lot of pest problems to speak of. And deer will browse it. It's not deer resistant, very much deer resistant, but it certainly is a very interesting, different plant. It's a conversation piece in the landscape for sure. This is a group of plants I want to talk about, which is emerging, slowly emerging as a player in the industry. So um, I do a lot of traveling and I talk to my folks down in the southeastern United States, the mid-Atlantic states, and Distilium is basically a relative of witch hazel that is evergreen. Those are the flowers in the early spring. You don't really grow it for its flowers, you more grow it for its foliage and its growth habit. But in many cases, it has very similar growth habit and texture to cherry laurel, almost like Otto and is rather shade tolerant, rather drought tolerant, um, and can be used in a lot of the ways you would have used cherry laurel. In fact, in Georgia, in Mississippi, in Louisiana, they're not growing Prunus lauris erasus. They need things that are more heat and drought tolerant, and this is one of them that is. For the longest time, we didn't think this would be hardy in our region, but we've had this plant in the garden now for about 8 or 10 years, and we haven't had any issues with it. It is remarkably shade tolerant. I mean, dense shade will be fine for this plant. It won't flower very much, but it certainly will grow. And as it establishes, we are finding it to be more and more deer resistant as well. So they might nibble on it at the beginning with that new foliage, but once it gets established and it has mature foliage, they tend not to as much. So I kind of like this Distilium. I'll show you some examples of it. This is a Distilium. There are hybrids. These are Distiliums that have been sheared into a more, formal planting. But there's a cultivar called Emerald Heights, which is more upright, as you can see on the right there. Nice medium foliage. This is in more sun. Vintage Jade is more of a spreader. Almost looks like a skip laurel a little bit. Probably going to get in the 4 to 5 foot range or more. Vintage Jade has been around for a while. Blue Cascade spreads, and it has a blue tinge to the foliage. So this is a really nice cultivar that I use quite a bit in both shade or sun. Cinnamon Girl has got this nice dense habit, sort of dense and spreading, and the new foliage is sort of a coppery color, so they call it Cinnamon Girl. This has done pretty well in our garden as well. The thing with Distiliums are they need to be spring planted and they need some time to establish, maybe 3 or 4 years to establish before they really take off. But once they do that, they are pretty low maintenance. I was at the Smithsonian Gardens a couple of years ago, and they're using Distilium everywhere there, and they use it as a hedge and they use it as a foundation planting, and it's working great. In fact, I think to the right here, this might have been somewhere in Washington D.C. on the right, and on the left, this is a garden in Maryland. But they do work as nice generic broadleaf evergreens. This is the cultivar called Athens Tower, which is more upright. I can see this being used as a replacement for boxwood, perhaps, with that nice, almost privet-like foliage. And this can be sheared into a different form, So, so some of these cultivars of Distilium are kind of interesting, and we're trying a lot of them. This is a gardenia that I found in Naples, Italy. I was traveling to Naples, Italy for vacation. And believe it or not, that is one plant. I don't know how old that plant is, but I imagine it's very, very old. And we love gardenias. They have a beautiful scent. They are, beautiful house plants. But here they're actually part of the Mediterranean landscape. And, there are people that I know that would lust to have a plant like this in their garden, but it's obviously too cold where we garden to grow these. However, there's a lot of work being done on potentially hardy gardenias. The standards, the standard bearers are frost-proof and climbs hardy that have been around for a while, and they have shown pretty reliable cold hardiness in our zone. But there are a lot of new ones coming out that are improved flowers improved scent, improved growth habit, improved foliage that we're trialing right now. We've been growing these cultivars for probably 3 or 4 years now. So slowly but surely we're trialing them. But I'll just show you a few of the selections of potentially hardy gardenias. This I would consider more emerging markets, because are they truly hardy? We just don't know enough yet, but there's certainly certain ones are pointing to in the direction of they're going to be pretty reliable for us. You go into a nursery and they look like this. You take them home and they may or may not be hardy depending on which cultivar you have. But this is one called Sweet Tea, which is a semi-double, very beautiful dark green, sort of luxurious, lustrous foliage. So some of the foliage on these gardenias is quite lovely too. And this one we're trialing right now. And that's what the habit is of Sweet Tea. Double Mint is a double flowering one with very, very fragrant, sweet flowers. Pinwheel is a single, which with a flat, open flower. Very different as well. And that's Pinwheel in the landscape. This is part of the Gardener's Confidence series. And then this plant, Snow Globe, is one we're trialing for several reasons. One of which is it's very nice, compact, rounded habit, but also look at those leaves. They almost look like azalea leaves. They're very rounded leaves and they have beautiful flowers. I could see this as a potential replacement for boxwood in certain situations. The gardenias we're growing, at least in the Northeast, we're thinking that these really need to be in some shade. I don't know that I want to put these in full sun. I think they'd be more exposed to the winter elements. So if you're going to use these or try these, I would try them in shade, quite frankly, and I would keep them away from a southern exposure. Winter southern exposure is the worst. It'll burn your hollies, it'll burn your camellias, and it'll certainly burn your gardenias. So keep it away from a southern exposure, put it in shade, maybe put it on an eastern exposure where you've got morning sunlight and afternoon shade, and I think you'll have much more success on this. And that's the flower on Snow Globe. And you think about it, this is a gardenia that's been sheared into a mound. And, you know, I could see this kind of looks like an azalea, kind of looks like a boxwood. It could look like a lot of things. And obviously when it goes in the flower, you're going to know what it is. But there's potential here of landscape function galore. Alyssium, for the longest time, you know, we would have never have thought that Alyssium would grow in our neck of the woods. And I had a friend of mine who was an incredible gardener who gardened in zone 6A. He gardened in Connecticut. And he said, oh, I've been growing that plant for years. Don't let the name Floridanium fool you. It's completely hardy in 6. And so we started using a lot of them. And then we got a bunch of cultivars from University of Georgia. And the reason this is a game changer for us is it's deer resistant. Where the rhododendrons and the mountain laurels and other things, azaleas, are being browsed by deer, they leave Alyssium alone for the most part. And sure, it's not the same in flower. It has a very small and conspicuous flower, but there are some new cultivars or newer cultivars out there that are pretty beautiful in flower. And so we're using this in areas where we need evergreen cover, in shade, dry shade even, but deer are a problem. So of course, Florida anise here, anise tree is in full sun. Woodland ruby is, I think, one of the best cultivars out there. It literally, this plant this year, bloomed heavily in the spring and sporadically bloomed in the entire summer into the fall. We had blooms on it, whether it be 5 blooms or 10 blooms or 15 blooms, the entire summer. And I really like this plant. It's a more open plant. It's got big, big flowers and a unbelievable performer. Pink Frost is one that's variegated, that the whatever's creamy color here will turn pink in the winter when it gets cold. So that's why it's called Pink Frost. As soon as the first frost comes, the leaves will turn pink, as you can see here. So this is what its winter color is. So it's got some foliage implications here. Not too bad. And that's what Pink Frost looks like in the summer as a normal shrub. And you can use it as a foundation planting, maybe instead of Nandina, maybe instead of other things. This could work. Obviously Florida Sunshine and Banana Appeal and some of those golden ones. I like using these gold ones with a green background. Use this with a low growing ground cover like Vinca or something. The differential between the green and the gold really play off each other very nicely. This is in Tennessee. And then this is Shady Lady, which is variegated with a very unusual, very, very, very pale pink flower. Interesting, very interesting plant. We use this in dense shade and it does incredibly well. And there's Shady Lady up close. Pretty clean and pretty consistent, pretty stable variegation on Shady Lady. This is one I'm planting more recently called Swamp Hobbit. It is a true dwarf. Only gets maybe a foot, foot and a half tall, maybe 2 feet tall at the most. It's very mounded and low. There was some thought that this would not be hardy in this area of the country, but we haven't had any issues with it. It's gone through 3 or 4 winters now. So Swamp Hobbit is another one that we're doing a lot with. There are some great species of Alyssium. If you're a collector, there are a lot of different species of Alyssium besides Floridanum, besides Parviflorum. Alyssium henryi is got these beautiful petite little flowers that are just really gorgeous. I mean, it's really a more minute detail, petite flower, but very beautiful little flowers. And the thing I like about Alyssium too is you can grow them in full sun too. This is sorry, this is anisatum, which is white with white flowers. That bloomed for us around March of last year. So this thing was in full bloom in March, April. Other potential boxwood replacements, by the way, Lonicera nitida and Lonicera palliata, 2 evergreen honeysuckles that we're starting to use more and more. They can be sheared, they can be left more natural. They have shown pretty decent deer resistance, these Loniceras. And, you know, there are some Loniceras that can be invasive. We know that. There's also some euonymus that can be invasive, and there's also some barberries that can be invasive. But there are some species that aren't. And so I think in this case, we need to be splitters and not lumpers. And these 2 particular species, I think, work pretty well. They are available if you look for them. And in a nursery, they might be a little more leggy and a little more open. You just got to do some pruning on them. This is Lonicera palliata in a nursery. And this is Lonicera nitida, has these tiny, tiny little leaves, almost like a boxwood. Takes shearing very well. That's Lonicera nitida sheared. You'd be hard pressed to tell if that was a holly, a boxwood, or anything else. And actually, I believe right behind it is Prunus lusitanica, that one with the big leaves there to the right. I believe is lusitanica. So these are available in certain nurseries. And you can use them in the mass plantings if you wanted to. This is heavily populated by deer, and the deer leave this alone. And there's even golden Loniceras. There's several golden forms, there's several variegated forms. They would work in more shade. So this can grow into shade as well. Osmanthus, you know, depending on where you live and depending on who you are, there are certain osmanthus that can be invasive. There are certain osmanthus that will fruit. On the east end of Long Island and the Hamptons, a lot of landscapers don't use this species anymore because they're saying that it's invasive. I have never seen this plant invasive in my garden or any place on the west coast or the west side of Long Island, or in any of the state for that matter. But there might be folks in the Mid-Atlantic region that say, I'm not using this plant anymore because it can be invasive. There are some clones that are not going to set fruit. So that might be one option. There's some cultivars that won't set fruit, but Osmanthus heterophyllus and some of the other species are tough. They are deer resistant, they're drought tolerant, they can be sheared very easily. So if you don't have a problem with invasive qualities of this plant, then you might want to try it. If you do have a problem with it, then you may want to try a cultivar or another species that isn't going to set fruit. But you know, Osmanthus heterophyllus as a trimmed hedge can certainly be functional. This is a very functional planting here as a foundation planting. And this is Gulf Tide, which is a cultivar that's juvenile. It's always spiny. This tends not to, it's always in the juvenile state, so it tends not to have fruit. So maybe try one of these juvenile clones. But this is Gulf Tide. Gulf Tide's pretty spiny. The reason why landscapers like this plant is because deer don't bother it. Except for the new growth, when the growth gets older and hardens off, this is a very good plant in deer country, and works as a barrier plant and is pretty tough. So a lot of landscapers are still using it because of its deer resistant qualities. And there's variegated ones like variegatus and goshiki. This is goshiki, a nice variegated one. Never seen fruit on this one either, and they're more compact. This is goshiki in a garden where it's just been left as a low mounded shrub, and it pretty much is showy all times of year, but in the winter it's especially showy when the landscape is pretty bare. And there are a lot of things being done with osmanthus. I have a friend of mine who's a grower, a nursery grower. He must have 15 different varieties of osmanthus heterophyllus. This is one with really, really tiny little leaves, and it flowers in the fall. Of course, it's fragrant. This is one called Party Princess with these tiny little leaves. These are more open, but you could certainly shear these into mounds if you wanted to. But there are these very petite little osmanthus that will grow, and you can use them as foundation plantings or other things. And Party Princess is one of them. These very, very tiny leaves that are spiny. He's grown this for a couple years, and there's many more like this. And those are those Party Princess plants. Again, here in the front as a foundation planting. Not going to get very tall. And there are, I went to Japan and they have osmanthus galore over there. These are just different types of osmanthus: osmanthus americanus, osmanthus fortunei, armatus. There's just so many osmanthus out there, and as things change, as the environment changes, we're starting to see more hardiness on these plants. There are actually breeders now breeding more hardiness into these plants because of their fragrant flowers, because of their showy flowers, because of the fact they bloom in the fall, and a lot of things don't bloom in the fall because of their deer-resistant qualities. I have not heard that osmanthus fortunei is invasive. That's the one on the bottom right here. So maybe go with one of those and try those and make sure it's not going to be a problem. This is osmanthus fortunei as a hedge. Across the street in this photo, it's about 30 yards from the bay. So it gets hit with a lot of wind and a lot of salt spray in the winter, and they just endure. They just do it. So osmanthus is a fairly valued genus anyway, in the average landscape. And that's osmanthus fortunei, those big holly-like leaves, in a landscape filled with deer, just filled with deer. This is a plant that's really underutilized, and I got to be an advocate for this plant because this is one of the parents of the red tip photinia. So we all know red tips, I'm sure. And when I went to school in the South, red tips were a real bane of many landscapers' existence. However, sometimes I think we go in reverse instead of forward, because while red tip photinias have all kinds of problems, they have canker problems, they have blight problems, they have leaf spot problems. Photinia cerulata, or serrata, sometimes called Chinese Photinia, is actually a really good plant, which it has less problems, has a beautiful flower. The leaves aren't quite red tip like, they're more of a bronzy color. But as a large evergreen that can be sheared or pruned in the landscape with ornamental qualities, I think it's a far superior plant than red tip photinia, and a far superior plant than cherry laurel and other things. Even could be used in place of holly. So I'll show you some pictures of this plant. I love this plant. This is on the right is Photinia cerulata in the spring. The new foliage is bronze, not quite red, but bronze. And on the left, that's its fall fruit. So it has a beautiful white flower. And then in the fall, it has these bunches of almost, I can't say holly, almost like um, sorbus-like fruit, the mountain ashes that you see in Europe. They have these big clusters of reddish purple fruit or reddish pink fruit. They are consistently like this. So they have fall interest, they have spring interest, and they have winter interest. So this is a plant that I really think should be used more, and it's a great broadleaf evergreen. Just because it's not really available doesn't mean we shouldn't use it. We should be promoting it and getting the word out there. That's how big Photinia serrulata can get if it's left unpruned, but you can certainly shear it into a hedge as well. So it is a very versatile plant. Mahonias, we're doing a lot with Mahonias as well. Mahonia is a plant that is in the barberry family. It's tough, it's versatile, it's deer resistant. And sure, Mahonia bealii is a very popular plant that everybody knows. But there's a lot of hybrids now and cultivars now. Has great foliage, has great fruit in the summer. Very shade tolerant, certainly very good in deer country. But I want to mention some of the cultivars. These have been around for a while. This is Winter Sun, which bloomed for us from Thanksgiving until recently. So it bloomed for about 2.5 months. And it has these beautiful yellow candelabra-like flowers. Very much a Zone 7 plant, so hardiness is not an issue. Upright, obviously, but just a better, more reliable flowering plant than most other Mahonias. Certainly better than Mahonia bealii or japonica. With these beautiful flowers that glow in the winter landscape. So this is Winter Sun. There is one called Marvel, which I'm sure you've seen this on the market. It's everywhere now. It does not have thorns or spines on its leaflets. So it's more of a smooth Mahonia, has smooth leaves, very, very beautiful foliage. And the flowering characteristics are spectacular. This is Marvel in full bloom last week. They are just stunningly beautiful when they're in flower. They hold a more compact growth habit. They're not as leggy as some of the other Mahonias. And in full sun, they just thrive. They will grow in shade pretty well, though. That's Marvel again from a distance. You can see the flowers here. They are actually fragrant. Flowers are fragrant. And there are other ones. We didn't think that Mahonia fortunei was going to be hardy in our zone, and this has come through the winter no problem. Extremely drought tolerant and extremely shade tolerant plant. So a more softer Mahonia, not as spiny, but interesting. And then a cultivar or a hybrid of that. Soft caress, I'm sure you've seen this Southern Living plant. It's been around for a while and it's everywhere. It's really grown more for its growth habit and its foliage than it is for its flowers, which are small. But as a foundation planting, as a plant to soften the landscape, literally, soft caress has actually done just fine for us. I would say it's not going to go further north than 7A or I'm sorry, 7B. 7A is pushing it with this plant. You got to really protect it. But in 7B, we're growing it just fine as a foundation planting with a little protection. And it is a very textural plant for sure. And that's soft caress in the landscape. This was taken today. So I just wanted to point out that the Mahonia collection we have, it's about 17 degrees outside. And these plants, even though they're waning, they've been blooming for about a month and a half now. They're still flowering even in cold weather. Myricas or Morella, the northern bayberry and the wax myrtle, both tough plants. They're native, obviously. I have a newfound respect for Myrica because it is remarkably heat and drought tolerant. It is one of those plants in the future is going to endure where a lot of other plants were going to fall off because of heat and humidity and global climate change. It's a plant that is bird friendly, it's pollinator friendly, it's deer resistant. It can be sheared, it can be grown near the seashore, it can be grown in the landscape. And as new cultivars come out that are more garden friendly, I think this plant is going to be a bigger player in the landscape. So, this is a female with its fruit, which is very good for migratory birds. This is at a beach, 100 feet from the ocean. And these myricas you see here are used as informal hedges are being grown with zero problems. They grow very, very quick in this pure sand situation. This is a cultivar called Bobby, and grows very quickly, tends to be more evergreen when you shear it, and indestructible in terms of disease and drought and heat and salt spray and all those things, and deer for that matter. So some of these cultivars that are coming now are more garden friendly. And they can be sheared or left natural, obviously. These are, by the way, this is, I can't understate or overstate how bad of a situation these plants are in. These plants are getting constant wind. There is no rest for the weary. There's no ever time here when they're not getting blasted with wind and salt spray. You can see where the water is. Just look straight ahead there. They're 100 yards from the water, and they get the blasting winds from the north. Another holly that I want to mention that's underutilized that should be used more, Ilex pedunculosa. It is the long stalk holly. It's a great, elegant specimen plant that should be used more. It's slow growing, yes. It's not the sexiest of hollies, but it's a very beautiful, smooth leaf that I think has a place in the landscape with those long stalks of the female fruit. Almost looks like a ficus when it in its leaf, but there are some, you can get some nice specimens of this and put them in the landscape and give them some room, and they will really do very well. I like this plant a lot. Viburnums, we'll talk about evergreen viburnums. I love this plant. Again, a plant that I never would have considered growing in zone 7A or B for that matter. But over time, this is a plant that we're seeing more and more hardiness for. Chindo, the cultivar, these thick leathery leaves that again almost look like cherry laurels, incredibly shade tolerant, becoming more and more, I'm having more and more faith in it in deer country as well. Very thick leaves, but a plant that can be pruned and sheared and used in a lot of different ways that you can use in the landscape. And so I like this Viburnum awabuki chindo. And these are fairly new plantings we put in the fall, and they've done incredibly well. They've acclimated very easily and have that beautiful thick foliage. And that's one season of growth. So they are moving along nicely, and they're extremely drought tolerant, extremely shade tolerant, and extremely pest resistant. Of course, it's all standbys. How can you not mention Viburnum retidophyllum? It's been around forever. It gets to be pretty big, obviously, but has shown very good resistance to deer, has shown very good resistance to viburnum leaf beetle, which can be a problem in our area. They're versatile. They can grow in shade, they can grow in sun, they can be sheared. Flowers aren't fragrant, but they're pretty ornamental. And it's a big shrub that you can use in lieu of holly, or in lieu of rhododendron, in lieu of a lot of things. Cree is a more compact variety. I have tried Cree. I'm sorry, folks, about the dog. Let me get that real quick. Sorry about that, folks. So this is Cree, which is a more compact variety. Retidophyloides is a little more garden friendly. It doesn't get as large as Retidophyllum. And I do love Allegheny, a very dark leafed, very thick leathery leaf on Allegheny. In zone 7B, it would be more evergreen and less semi-evergreen. Willowwood is a great compact variety of Viburnum retidophyloides. And here's willowwood growing in the landscape. So a little more trainable, very nice dark green leaves, and of course, a nice flower in the spring. Prague viburnum tends to do well from zone 5 to zone 7 or so. Not so good in zone 8, but a plant that you'd want to put in shade as well. We've had good success with this in deer country as well, with those nice leaves, and a very, very shade tolerant plant. Pretty good flowering plant too. The Birkwood viburnum being one of the more fragrant viburnums. There are some good cultivars of this that I'll mention. Tends to be semi-evergreen for us, but this is a great variety. If anyone doesn't know this variety, or if you do know it, it's not an easy plant to find, but it's a low growing compact version of Birkwood viburnum that is reliably evergreen. It has these beautiful profusion of flowers in the spring, very fragrant, and it's only going to stay in the 4 to 5 foot range, maybe 6 foot range at best. You can see on the bottom right before they get some size to them, and then on the top left, as they get starting to grow in the landscape. But very, very fragrant plant, Kanoi. Really nice leaves, really nice flowers, and that's Kanoi about 10, 12 years in. So you can see the plants, maybe those are 2 plants, so probably 5 or 6 feet wide and about 4.5 feet tall. That's not sheared, by the way. It's a cultivar worth looking for. And as long as you're giving it well-drained soil, it will be fine. And then there's this one. This is Prolific. Prolific is a newer version of Kanoi. It was developed, I believe, in the Southeast, and has these nice, beautiful, luxurious, lustrous evergreen leaves, and a profusion of white flowers. Prolific. So this is one that's a nice spring bloomer. There's the flowers on Prolific, and there's the heavy, massive floral display of Prolific. And then this viburnum, this is Riefler's dwarf, which grows in zone 7 just fine. It's a very, very heat and drought tolerant plant. Does extremely well in southern states and mid-Atlantic states as well. And you can shear this very nicely into a boxwood looking thing or a holly looking thing, but it's a viburnum. And this would be truly evergreen. Very, very easy to mold, this plant, Viburnum Riefler's dwarf. And there's Riefler's dwarf. This plant's about 7 or 8 years old, never been pruned. Nice compact plant. And the foliage is pretty small. So I wanted to thank you for your time. I do have a website where you can download plant lists. You can get links to other websites that might be helpful to you, including nurseries where you can find unusual or hard to find things. Obviously, you live in a great area of the country where there's a lot of great growers and nurseries. So if you can buy locally, you should. But there are a lot of great nurseries out there that you can also look online and tap into to buy things that are more unusual, the road less traveled, as they say. You can certainly check my website out, and I have a lot of good information that you can utilize. But I think the more our environment changes and the more we see issues with blights and disease and pests and a changing environment, more heat and humidity, we're going to have to rely more on the industry to develop plants that are more durable and adaptable in the landscape. And that includes broadleaf evergreens, which are the hardest, I think, to deal with, because again, they have the most skin in the game, if you will. They have leaves all the time. They're the most vulnerable in the landscape, but we need them. When you think about a landscape without broadleaf evergreens, it would be a terrible place to live, I think. So we want our conifers and we want our deciduous plants, but we also want our broadleaf evergreens as well. And hopefully with advanced technology and with selecting and all these brilliant minds that are working on plant breeding, we'll continue to have a good selection of these broadleaf evergreens to use in our landscapes. So thank you very much, and I will certainly be available for questions.
Vincent, that is amazing amount of new plants that you have introduced us to. And I just wanted to point out that Jim Hughes put in the chat that some of those plants have been available at the FONA Friends of the National Arboretum plant sale for the last that is usually held the last week, that is always held the last weekend in April. And to look for some of those there if you want to buy them in person and support the National Arboretum. Are there any other questions? Comments? Sounds like we have a quiet group tonight.
Yes, I have a question.
Go
Okay.
ahead, Marjorie.
Okay. My question about the mahonias that have the more slender, more beautiful soft leaves, are they also deer resistant?
That's a great question, and I was going to bring that up, and you reminded me. Unfortunately, not. I would say that soft caress would be a little more susceptible to deer browsing. Now, we haven't seen a lot of deer browsing on it, but if they're really, really hungry, they're certainly going to go for a soft caress because it's softer and more palatable than, say, Mahonia belii or some of the others.
Right.
I wouldn't say that they were highly prone to deer browsing or deer, munching, but they're would be in the middle of the road as opposed to a real spiny Mahonia belii or Mahonia japonica. So if you have a high deer population, you may want to put them someplace a little more hidden, a little more secluded.
Mhm.
But certainly I wouldn't say they'd be decimated either. I've never seen them just totally eaten to the ground unless the deer are really, really desperate.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah.
I think there are some additional questions, and if y'all could just go ahead and ask those. I do have to step away for just about 2 minutes, but go ahead and ask your questions, and I'll be back on in a few minutes.
I wondered
Great.
about the deer resistance of some of the camellias.
That's another great question. So here's the deal with camellias that we've found. Now we have a pretty high deer population, but deer resistance is based on there's so many factors. So one of the big factors is how big is your deer population? Another factor is what other vegetation is there for them to eat besides your garden plants? What's the understory look like? What predators are in the area, if any? What does mama teach baby? I mean, there's so many factors that go into deer resistance. I would say this, we have a pretty healthy deer population here. And remarkably, we have a very large rhododendron collection that they don't bother for whatever reason. They leave our rhododendrons alone. They will eat azaleas before they'll eat rhododendrons, which is amazing. But in terms of camellias, what we're finding is older established camellias that have been around for a while. We have some camellias that are 40 years old that have very thick, leathery leaves, big, thick leaves. And they tend to leave those alone. They might rub them, the bucks might rub them, but they tend to leave those alone. It's the new camellias we put in with that very soft, pliable foliage that they tend to eat more. They'll nibble on them. And then once they get some size to them and get their foliage hardens off a little bit, they tend to leave them alone. They go after other things. So I think initially they're more vulnerable, especially if you have no camellias in your yard. They might be more curious and might nibble on them. But I think over time, if you can get it to a certain size, they'd be less prone to bother them.
Thank you.
Sure. Next question.
Other questions?
Anybody else?
I'd like to know if you can offer any tips on succeeding with the Daphne odora. I've struggled with those. Is sighting an issue? What can you do to help?
Well, you absolutely positively should give it as well drained of soil as you can. And I've seen them successful in Georgia where it's clay soil, but it's pretty well drained clay soil. I don't know what kind of garden soil you have, but anything drained will be okay. I also like adding rotted compost to a mix when I plant them. I also plant them a little higher than everything else, so I'll actually mound them up a little bit, almost burn them a little bit because that gives them additional drainage. And I would also keep those away from a southern exposure. I would keep them in shade, partial shade, and I would keep them away from a southern exposure, which can be deadly for most broadleaf evergreens. But the drainage is a factor. If you have poorly drained soils or heavy soils, they tend not to be as happy. I use mine in our rock garden where it's very well drained, or in our case, we have very rich soils that's very well drained, loamy soils, and they do fine for that. But I actually do burn them up to give them additional drainage. So drainage is a big issue with any Daphne, but they tend to be more, you have more wiggle room with a Daphne odora than you would with some of the other Daphne species.
Thank you.
Yep.
I just wanted to say that I did well with a couple of different Daphnes under a Parodia. And
Oh,
I think
wow.
it was partly because the Parodia sucked up all the extra moisture.
That's very possible.
And I think I finally lost the big one because I let too many Parodia leaves around the bottom.
Right.
So that was my fault. But yeah, I mean, they're notorious for croaking around here, and I had at least 10 years. So it wasn't an odora, I don't think. But in any case, there was a slight slope, and it was partial shade, and the Parodia is very thirsty.
Yep,
So,
that makes sense. That definitely makes sense.
just-
Yeah, certainly Daphne odora, I think it thrives in drier shade too. It's really very durable that way. So it doesn't mind root competition as long as it's not heavily root competition. But someone in the chat, what about Daphne Genkwa? Daphne Genk is one of the most beautiful, Genkwa is one of the most beautiful Daphnes there is in bloom. I have had, unfortunately, I've had issues with it though, as far as phytophthora root rot. So it definitely needs to be really, really well drained. Anybody else? Okay, well, everyone, I really appreciate your time. I hope you get through I don't know how cold it is there, but I hope you get through the winter just fine and your plants get through the winter just fine. And this spring, you might have some opportunities to plant some additional broadleaf evergreens in the landscape, and I hope you have success with them.
I think we're all excited and you've got us raring to go. So thank you so much for a wonderful talk, Vincent.
Okay, thank you all very much. I hope you have a great night.
All right, good night.
Take care.